When the aging patriarch falls gravely ill and summons every descendant home for one final reunion, the heroine has no choice but to return to the mansion that once rejected her. By her side is her 4-year-old son, the only legitimate grandson and sole heir of the Falcone bloodline, whose existence no one in the family has ever known. You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Romance channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. Elena Marchetti had promised herself she would never again drive up the long gravel road that led to the Falcone estate. 5 years ago, she had walked down that same road in the rain, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and a secret that would change the rest of her life. And she had sworn, to herself, to God, to the crying infant she didn't yet know she carried, that she would never come back. And yet here she was, gripping the steering wheel of her rented Audi so hard her knuckles had gone white, watching the wrought iron gates of the Falcone mansion rise out of the New York autumn mist like the gates of a fortress built to keep the world both out and in. In the back seat, her son Nico pressed his small hand against the window glass. "Mummy, is that a castle?" "Something like that, baby." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The letter had arrived 4 days ago, delivered not by mail, but by a black-suited man who had waited on her porch in Ohio until she answered the door, his expression carved from stone. Don Vincenzo Falcone requests the presence of every descendant of his blood by Sunday for what may be his final dinner. No more words were needed. Everyone in that world knew what final meant when it came from a man like Vincenzo. Elena was not, technically, his descendant. She had never been permitted to be. But her son was. The only legitimate grandchild of Dante Falcone, heir in blood if not in name. And if there was one thing the old Don valued above his own pride, it was the continuation of the Falcone line. She hadn't told them Nico existed. Not once, not in 5 years, not through a single phone call or letter. She had built a wall around her son so high that not even the Falcones, with their money and their reach and their terrifying patience, had found a crack in it. Now the wall was about to come down, because a dying man's summons was not something you refused. Refusal, in this family, was a kind of death sentence, social if not literal. The gates opened without her needing to press the buzzer. Someone had been watching for her car. She parked in the wide circular driveway among a small fleet of black SUVs and one obscenely expensive silver convertible that she recognized instantly, viscerally, in the pit of her stomach, though she hadn't seen it in 5 years. It had belonged to Dante's younger brother once. It probably still did. Her hands trembled as she unbuckled Nico from his car seat. "Remember what we talked about, sweetheart. You stay close to Mommy. No wandering off. This is a business trip." "Like your work trips?" "Exactly like that. A lie, wrapped inside a lie, wrapped inside the biggest lie of all. That she could walk into that house and keep her son invisible." The front doors opened before she reached the top step, and the man who filled the doorway stopped her heart cold. Dante Falcone had not softened in 5 years. If anything, the boy she remembered, sharp-jawed, hungry-eyed, 26 and reckless with love, had been replaced by something harder, colder, more dangerous. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him like a second skin, and his dark hair was cut shorter than she remembered, threaded faintly with premature grey at the temples, that made him look less like the young heir apparent and more like the Don he was clearly being groomed to become. His eyes found hers first. Then they dropped, unerringly, unstoppably, to the small boy standing half-hidden behind her leg. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Elena had ever heard. Elena. His voice was low, rough, a stranger's voice wearing a familiar coat. I brought my son. She lifted her chin, refusing to let the tremor in her hands reach her words. His name is Nico. Dante's gaze did not move from the boy. Elena watched something break open behind his eyes. Grief, fury, disbelief, and beneath all of it, unmistakably, a wild and terrible hope. "How old is he?" Dante said. It wasn't a question, it was a man doing math he already knew the answer to and dreading the confirmation. 4. Elena made herself hold his stare. He turned 4 in March, 9 months after she had left this house in the rain. Dante's jaw tightened until a muscle jumped beneath his skin, and for one unguarded moment, Elena saw the boy she had loved flicker back into existence behind the mask of the man he'd become. "Papa is waiting," was all he said, and stepped back to let them in, though his eyes never once left his son. The foyer alone could have swallowed Elena's entire childhood home. Marble floors gleamed beneath a chandelier the size of a small car, and portraits of dead Falcone men in dark suits lined the grand staircase like a jury that had already reached its verdict on her long before she'd walked in. Elena remembered this house as a battlefield of whispered judgments. The way conversations died when she entered a room, the way Dante's mother had once looked at her like something scraped off the bottom of a shoe. She had been 22 then, in love for the first time in her life, foolish enough to believe love could outrun blood. Now she walked those same floors, with her son's small hand locked in hers, and she felt every eye in that house turn toward them, like gun barrels swinging into position. Elena Marchetti. The voice belonged to Sofia Falcone, Dante's cousin, emerging from the sitting room with a martini in one manicured hand and an expression of pure, delighted malice. "I didn't think you'd have the nerve." "Sophia," Elena kept her tone even. "Still exactly where I left you, I see." "And who?" Sophia said, crouching slightly, predator smooth, to examine Nico with the same interest she might show a piece of jewellery. "Is this?" "My son." Elena drew Nico gently behind her. "Don't." Something shifted in Sophia's face. Quick calculation, the kind that ran in this family like a genetic trait. She straightened, glanced toward Dante, who had gone rigid as a blade beside them, and her painted mouth curved into a smile that promised nothing good. "Well," she murmured, "this dinner just got interesting." Dante's hand closed around Elena's elbow, not roughly, but with a possessive certainty that sent heat crawling up her arm despite everything. "Not here," he said quietly, and steered her and Nico down the hall before Sophia could say another word. He led them into a small parlour off the main corridor, empty, quiet, the kind of room reserved for private conversations that were never meant to be overheard. He shut the door behind them and turned, and for the first time in 5 years, Elena stood close enough to him to see the faint white scar above his eyebrow she didn't remember, to smell the same cedar and gunmetal scent that had once meant safety to her, and now meant only danger. 5 years, he said. His voice was quiet, controlled, and it frightened her more than shouting would have. 5 years, Elena. You let me believe. He stopped himself, jaw tight, and glanced down at Nico, who was staring up at him with wide, curious eyes that were, Elena knew with a sick lurch, unmistakably Dante's eyes. You let me believe there was nothing left of us. There wasn't supposed to be anything left of us, Elena said. Your family made that decision for us, in case you forgot. Your mother had my father dragged out of this house in front of half of Manhattan's underworld and called him a traitor to his face. Your brother told me to my face that if I ever came near you again, he'd make sure I disappeared. What was I supposed to do, Dante? Send a Christmas card? You could have told me. His voice cracked, just slightly, just enough. You could have told me I had a son. And what would you have done? Elena's own voice rose now, 5 years of buried grief breaking the surface. Defied your father? Left your empire for a woman your family had already destroyed? We both know how that story ends, Dante. It ends with me in a shallow grave somewhere upstate, and my son raised by strangers. Nico tugged on her sleeve. Mommy, why is the man sad? The question landed in the room like a small bomb. Dante's whole body seemed to fold inward, some hard architecture inside him cracking at the plain, devastating honesty only a child could offer. He crouched slowly, bringing himself to Nico's eye level, moving with the same careful precision Elena imagined he used when disarming something dangerous. I'm not sad, Piccolo, he said, and his voice had gone soft in a way Elena had almost forgotten he was capable of. I'm just surprised, in a good way. His eyes flicked up to Elena's face, dark and unreadable and burning. The best surprise I've had in a very long time. Nico studied him with the frank, unguarded assessment only small children could get away with. You have the same eyes as me, he said, matter-of-factly. Dante's throat worked. Yes, he said, roughly. I suppose I do. Outside the parlour door, footsteps approached, measured, unhurried, deliberately loud enough to announce themselves. Dante rose in one fluid motion, his expression sliding back into its careful mask, a heartbeat before the door opened. Matteo Falcone stood in the doorway, golden and smiling and utterly without warmth, his eyes moving from his brother to Elena to the small boy between them with the swift, cataloguing precision of a man counting money. Well, well, Matteo said softly, the prodigal daughter returns, and she's brought a gift. Vincenzo Falcone's bedroom occupied the entire east wing of the 3rd floor, and even dying, even shrunken beneath silk sheets with an oxygen tube taped beneath his nose, he commanded the space like a king holding court from his final battlefield. Elena had met him only twice before, both times terrifying encounters she still dreamed about. He looked smaller now, the flesh of his once formidable face sunken against the bone, but his eyes, dark, assessing, missing nothing, were exactly as she remembered them. Elena Marchetti. His voice rasped like paper tearing, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. I did not think you would come. You didn't leave much room for refusal, Don Falcone. A dry, wheezing sound that might have been a laugh. No, I did not. His gaze slid past her to the boy at her side, and Elena felt the entire room hold its breath. "And who is this?" Dante stepped forward before she could answer, positioning himself half a pace in front of Elena and Nico with the unconscious protectiveness of an animal shielding its young. "Papa, this is Nico. He's my son." The silence that followed had weight, texture, a physical presence in the room. Vincenzo's eyes moved slowly from Dante's face to the boy's, tracing the resemblance with the ruthless precision of a man who had spent 70 years reading faces for lies. "Come here, boy," Vincenzo said finally. Nico looked up at his mother, uncertain. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, every protective instinct in her screaming to grab her son and run. But she nodded once and released his hand. Nico crossed the room with the fearless curiosity of a 4-year-old, who did not yet understand the weight of the world he'd been born into, and stopped at the edge of the massive bed. "Are you sick?" Nico asked, with the blunt honesty only children possessed. "Yes," Vincenzo said, "very sick. My friend Sam had chickenpox, and he got better." Something in the old man's ruined face shifted, not quite a smile, but close to one. "I am afraid this is not chickenpox, bambino." He studied the boy a moment longer, and then, to Elena's shock, reached out one trembling, spotted hand and rested it gently on Nico's small head. "But I am glad, very glad, to have met you before the end." Across the room, Elena caught the flicker of something dark crossing Matteo's face, there and gone so fast she might have imagined it, if she hadn't spent 5 years training herself to read exactly that kind of expression on exactly that kind of man. "Papa," Matteo said smoothly, stepping forward, "you must be exhausted. Perhaps introductions can wait until dinner." "I have waited 78 years for many things, Matteo," Vincenzo said, without looking at him. "I do not intend to waste what time I have left waiting on your convenience." His eyes returned to Nico, softer now than Elena had ever imagined them capable of being. "Tell me, child, do you know what family you come from?" Nico shook his head solemnly. "You come from a very old family," Vincenzo said. "A family that has survived wars, betrayals, the deaths of many men who thought themselves untouchable. It is a heavy inheritance." His eyes lifted to Dante, and then, deliberately, to Matteo. "One that requires the right hands to carry it." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Elena watched Matteo's easy smile tighten at the corners, watched something calculating pass behind his handsome, camera-ready face. "Of course, Papa," Matteo said, his voice smooth as oil over broken glass. "Family is everything." "Is it?" Vincenzo said, and there was an edge in the old man's rasping voice that made the hair on Elena's arms rise. "We shall see, at dinner, exactly how much everyone in this family believes that." His gaze moved once more to Elena, unreadable, ancient. "You will sit at my right hand tonight, Elena Marchetti. You and the boy." "Papa," Dante began, "it is decided." Vincenzo's eyes closed, exhaustion overtaking him like a tide. "Now leave me. I must rest before I face this family of vipers and wolves one final time." They filed out of the room in silence, but at the threshold, Elena felt a hand close around her wrist, not Dante's. She turned to find Matteo standing close, too close, his cologne cloying and expensive, his smile a beautiful, terrible thing. Welcome home, Elena, he said softly, for her ears alone. It's been far too long. I do hope you remember how this family handles its complications. The guest wing, where Elena and Nico were installed, had, in a small cruelty she suspected was entirely deliberate, once belonged to her father during the brief, doomed years he had served as Vincenzo's consigliere. The furniture had changed, but the view from the window, the long sweep of manicured lawn falling away toward the black iron fence, was exactly as she remembered it from the last terrible night she had spent in this house. She sat on the edge of the massive bed and watched Nico explore the room with the boundless energy of a child who had no idea he was standing at the centre of a war that predated his birth by decades. "Mummy, look, there's a pool outside." "I see it, baby." Elena's voice came out thinner than she intended. There was a knock at the door, not loud, not urgent, but unmistakably Dante's particular way of knocking, 3 measured raps that she remembered from 100 stolen nights 5 years ago. She opened it to find him standing in the hallway, still in his suit, his tie loosened, looking for all the world like a man who hadn't slept properly in years. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Please." She glanced back at Nico, who had found the television remote and was thoroughly absorbed in cartoons, and stepped into the hallway, pulling the door mostly closed behind her. 5 minutes, Dante said. "That's all I'm asking. You have 5 years of questions and you think 5 minutes will cover it. Then give me longer." Something raw broke through his careful composure. "Elena, please, I need to understand. I need you to tell me what happened. All of it. Not the version your father told you. Not the version my family told everyone else. What actually happened the night you left?" Elena crossed her arms, an old defensive habit that had never quite left her. "You don't remember?" "I remember you were gone by morning. I remember my mother telling me you'd left of your own free will, that you'd taken money from Matteo to disappear, that you never loved me at all." His jaw tightened. "I remember believing it for longer than I'm proud of." "And now?" "Now I have a 4-year-old son who has my eyes and my mother's stubborn chin, and I understand that I was lied to." His voice had dropped to something dangerously quiet. "By my own family. About the woman I was going to marry." The words hung between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Elena felt the old grief rise in her throat, sharp and sudden as a blade. "Your brother came to me," she said finally, "the night before we were supposed to leave together. Do you remember? We had it all planned. Chicago, new names, a life outside this world." "I remember." His voice had gone hoarse. "Matteo came to my apartment at 2 in the morning. He had photographs, Dante. Photographs of my father meeting with the Bratva liaison outside a warehouse in Red Hook. Meetings I later learned Matteo himself had arranged. Meetings my father walked into because Matteo told him it was Vincenzo's own order. He told me if I didn't disappear that night without a word, without a note, he would use those photographs to prove my father had been feeding your family's secrets to the Russians for years. He said he'd have my father killed in front of me, and then he'd make sure you were blamed for helping me hide him. He said," her voice cracked, "he said he'd make sure our children, if we ever had any, would grow up fatherless and hunted, generation after generation, because that's what happens to traitors' bloodlines in this family." Dante had gone perfectly, terribly still. "And you believed him?" I was 22, Dante, and I had already watched what this family did to people it decided didn't belong. I believed him because I had seen exactly what your mother was capable of, exactly what this house does to anyone it labels an enemy. I left because I thought it was the only way to keep you both alive. Tears she'd promised herself she wouldn't shed slid hot down her face. I didn't know I was pregnant yet. I found out 3 weeks later, alone, in a motel in Cleveland, and I made a choice. I decided my son would never know the name Falcone unless it was safe for him to carry it. Dante closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that contradicted every hard, dangerous line of him. "It's safe now," he said, low and fierce. "I swear to you, Elena, it is safe now. And it will be safe for the rest of both your lives, or I will burn this entire family to the ground trying to make it so. Your brother is still in that house." I know. Something cold and lethal moved behind his eyes, and I intend to find out exactly what role Matteo played in all of this, if it's the last thing I do. Dinner was still 2 hours away, and the mansion's oppressive silence had begun to feel like a held breath. So when Dante suggested they get some air, genuine air, away from the watching portraits and the whispering cousins, Elena found herself agreeing before she'd fully considered what getting air meant in the world of the Falcone family. It meant, apparently, a black car gliding through the city toward a nightclub Elena had never set foot in, a converted warehouse on the edge of the meatpacking district called the Serpent's Den, its entrance marked by nothing more than a discreet brass plaque and 2 men built like refrigerators. "I thought we were talking," Elena said, as they stepped out of the car, Nico safely left at the mansion, under the watchful eye of an elderly housekeeper Dante trusted implicitly, a woman named Carmela, who had known him since he was in diapers. "We are talking." Dante's hand settled at the small of her back as they walked toward the entrance, a touch that was both proprietary and, infuriatingly, comforting. Just somewhere I can actually think without my father's portrait staring down at me. Inside, the club pulsed with low red light and a bass line that thrummed up through the soles of Elena's shoes. It was, she realized, a place Dante owned. The deference in every staff member's face as they passed made that clear. And something about seeing him move through his own domain, controlled and commanding, sent an unwelcome shiver of old desire crawling up her spine. He led her to a private booth on the mezzanine level, elevated above the dance floor, glass walls affording a view of the crowd below without allowing anyone below to see in. "You built all this," Elena said, settling into the leather seat across from him. "I built a great many things, trying not to think about you." Dante's voice was low, rough, with an honesty that seemed to cost him something to give. "It didn't work particularly well." A waitress appeared, poured 2 glasses of dark, amber liquor without being asked, and vanished as silently as she'd come. Dante didn't touch his. "Tell me about him," he said instead. "Nico, tell me everything. What does he like? Is he happy? Has he asked about his father?" The questions came out of him in a rush, 5 years of longing compressed into a handful of desperate sentences, and Eleanor felt something in her chest crack open, despite every wall she'd built to protect it. "He likes dinosaurs," she said softly. "And he's terrified of thunderstorms, which is ironic because he's fearless about almost everything else. He tried to pet a stray dog last month that had clearly bitten someone before. He asks about you sometimes." I used to tell him his father was away for work, somewhere far, doing something important. I hated lying to him. Her voice caught. I hated it every single time. Dante's hand found hers across the table, his thumb tracing slow, unconscious circles over her knuckles. You did what you had to keep him safe. I understand that now. His dark eyes lifted to hers, burning with something that hadn't dimmed in 5 years of separation, 5 years of grief and rage and forced distance. But I am done being lied to, Eleanor. About you, about him, about what happened between us. I want the truth, and I want it now. From everyone in that house, even if it means tearing the whole family apart to get it. That's dangerous talk in a family like yours. I don't care. His grip on her hand tightened, not painfully, but with an intensity that stole her breath. I spent 5 years believing you'd abandoned me for money. 5 years hating a ghost of you that never existed. I am not going to spend the rest of my life letting my brother's lies dictate what's left of mine. He leaned closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath against her cheek, close enough that the old, dangerous pull between them roared back to life with terrifying speed. I loved you when I was 26 and stupid enough to believe love could survive anything. I love you now, Elena, older and considerably less stupid, and I am not letting you walk out of my life a second time. Not you. Not our son. Dante, don't, he said softly. Tell me it's complicated. I know it's complicated. I have buried men for less complicated problems than this one. His thumb brushed along her jaw, tilting her face up toward his. Just tell me you still feel it too. That's all I'm asking tonight. Elena's heart slammed against her ribs, every rational thought she'd carefully constructed over 5 years of solitary parenting dissolving beneath the weight of his gaze. I never stopped, she whispered, hating herself for the admission, even as it left her lips. That's the problem, Dante. I never once stopped. The kiss that followed was not gentle. It was 5 years of grief and longing crashing together at once, his hand fisting in her hair, hers gripping the lapel of his jacket like she might drown without the anchor of him. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, Dante rested his forehead against hers. Whatever happens at that dinner tonight, he said quietly, know this. I am not letting either of you go again. By the time they returned to the mansion, the great dining hall had begun to fill with falcones of every branch and generation summoned from across the country by the same grim letter that had brought Elena back into this world. Elena had never seen the family assembled in full before. Not even at the height of her relationship with Dante had she been permitted to witness a true falcone gathering. Now she stood at the entrance to the dining hall, Nico's hand once again anchored in hers, and took in the sheer scale of the empire she'd once been forbidden to touch. There was Vincenzo's younger sister, Isabella, a formidable woman in her 70s who ran the family's shipping interests out of Miami. There were cousins from Chicago, cousins from Providence, a great-nephew who'd flown in from a business posting in Palermo that Elena suspected was considerably less legitimate than his LinkedIn profile suggested. And presiding over all of it, seated already at the head of a table long enough to seat 30, was Matteo, golden and gracious, playing the perfect host in his father's stead. Elena, Isabella's voice cut through the low murmur of conversation as they entered, and every head in the room turned in unison. "I did not expect to see you in this house again." "Neither did I, Signora Falcone." Elena kept her chin high. "But your brother's summons did not leave room for refusal." Isabella's sharp eyes moved to Nico, and something flickered across her weathered face. Surprise, quickly masked, calculation quickly following. "And this child?" "My grandson," came a rasping voice from the doorway, and the room fell utterly silent as Vincenzo, supported on one side by a nurse and the other by Dante, made his slow, laborious way to the head of the table. Dante's son, Elena's son, the only legitimate grandchild this family has produced in over a decade, and I will not have anyone in this room forget it. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Elena watched a dozen calculating expressions ripple across the assembled family, watched fortunes and inheritances and decades-old grievances recalculate themselves in real time behind carefully composed faces. Matteo rose smoothly from his seat at the head of the table. Vincenzo's seat, Elena realized, a small but unmistakable claim he'd been making in his father's absence, and offered his most disarming smile.
"Papa, this is wonderful news. A new heir, the family's future secured."
His eyes met Elena's, and beneath the warmth of his expression, she saw something colder, harder, calculating. "Though I must say, Elena, it's rather remarkable that you kept such news from us for 4 years. One might almost call it deceptive." "One might also call it self-preservation," Dante said quietly, helping his father into his seat at the head of the table, "given what this family did to the last woman who tried to be honest in this house." The barb landed exactly where intended. Matteo's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went flat and dangerous. "That's ancient history, brother." "Is it?" Vincenzo's rasping voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Sit, all of you. We will discuss ancient history at length tonight, I assure you." The family took their seats in a slow, wary shuffle, old hierarchies reasserting themselves around the massive table. Elena found herself seated at Vincenzo's right hand, as promised, Nico beside her on a booster seat some thoughtful staff member had procured, Dante on her other side, close enough that his leg pressed warm and solid against hers beneath the table. Across from them, Matteo sat with his wife, Camille, a beautiful, brittle woman who Elena had met only once before, and who now watched the proceedings with the wary attention of someone calculating exactly how much this new heir threatened her own children's inheritance. "Before we eat," Vincenzo said, his rasping voice somehow carrying to every corner of the vast room, "I have something to say to this family. Something I have carried for 5 years, and which I intend to release tonight, whatever the cost." Matteo's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around his wineglass. "Papa, you're unwell. Perhaps this can wait until—" "It has waited 5 years, Matteo." Vincenzo's dark eyes found his younger son's face and held there, ancient and unyielding. "It will not wait 1 hour longer." Elena felt Dante's hand find hers beneath the table, gripping it tight, and beside her, Nico, sensing the sudden tension in the adults around him without understanding its source, pressed closer against her side. "5 years ago," Vincenzo began, "I was told that Salvatore Marchetti, my consigliere, and once my most trusted friend, had betrayed this family to the Bratva. I was shown photographs.
I was given testimony. I believed it because the evidence was compelling and because the man who brought it to me had never once given me reason to doubt his loyalty. His eyes moved, slow and deliberate, to Matteo. I have since had reason to reconsider that belief. The dining hall had gone utterly, deathly silent. "Papa," Matteo said, his voice carefully modulated, though Elena could see the tension coiling in his shoulders beneath his expensive suit. "I don't know what you've heard, or from whom, but I would remind you that Salvatore Marchetti's guilt was established beyond doubt. The Bratva liaison confirmed the meetings. The financial records confirmed the transfers. This is not a matter of opinion, it is a matter of fact." "Financial records that you obtained," Vincenzo said quietly. "A liaison whose testimony you personally arranged. Photographs taken by a man on your private payroll."
He paused, letting the accusation settle over the table like a shroud. "I have spent the last 3 months since my diagnosis doing something I should have done 5 years ago, Matteo. I hired an independent investigator, a man with no loyalty to any branch of this family, no stake in the outcome, only a fee and a reputation for thoroughness." Elena's heart had begun to pound so hard she was certain the whole table could hear it. Beside her, Dante had gone rigid, his eyes fixed on his brother's face with an intensity that promised violence. "And what," Matteo said, his smile thinning to something brittle, "did this investigator find?"
"That Salvatore Marchetti met with a man he believed to be a legitimate business associate of this family at meetings arranged through a series of intermediaries that traced back, eventually, after considerable digging, to accounts controlled by you." Vincenzo's voice had gone hard as flint. That the financial transfers used as evidence of his betrayal were, in fact, structured to look like payments to Salvatore, when the money trail actually originated from your own accounts and terminated in a shell company in the Caymans that you personally established 2 years before Salvatore's supposed treason. That the Bratva liaison who testified against him was paid $400,000 for his testimony by an account traced back again to you. The room had erupted into hushed, urgent whispers, cousins turning to one another in shock and calculation. But Vincenzo held up one trembling hand, and silence fell once more. "You destroyed a good man's reputation," Vincenzo said, his rasping voice thick with something that might have been grief, might have been rage, might have been both. "You had him branded a traitor before this entire family, before every allied house in this city. You drove him into hiding, where he died 3 years later, alone, in a rented room in Queens, believing his own daughter had abandoned him out of shame." His eyes found Elena's, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something that looked almost like an apology in the old man's ancient face. "I am told, Elena, that this is true, that your father died believing he had destroyed his own daughter's happiness." Elena's vision blurred with sudden, furious tears. "He wrote me a letter," she said, her voice shaking, "before he died. He said he didn't understand what he'd done wrong. He said he'd always been loyal, and he couldn't understand why the family he'd served for 20 years had turned on him without warning." Her hands curled into fists in her lap. "I told myself it was grief talking. I told myself the evidence must have been real, because why would anyone lie about something so serious?" Her eyes lifted to Matteo's face, and the rage that had been simmering in her for 5 years finally, fully ignited. "But it was you. The whole time it was you." "This is absurd," Matteo said, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence, cracking at the edges. "An investigator's report, purchased by a dying man desperate for someone to blame." "Do not," Vincenzo said, his voice suddenly terrifyingly strong, "insult me by calling me desperate, boy. I built this family's empire with my own 2 hands while your grandfather was still learning to walk. I know a lie when I am shown one, and I know the truth when I finally see it, however many years too late." His dark eyes bored into his younger son with a fury Elena had not thought a dying man capable of. "Why, Matteo? That is all I want to know. Why would you destroy an innocent man, drive your own brother's love from this house, orphan a child you did not even know existed? All to what end?" Matteo's jaw worked silently for a long moment, calculation warring with fury behind his handsome face. And then, slowly, terribly, he began to laugh, a low, humorless sound that raised the hair on Elena's arms. "To what end?" Matteo rose from his chair, all pretense of gracious hosting finally abandoned, his voice rising with a wild, dangerous energy that silenced every whisper in the room. "To what end, Papa? Because Dante was always your favorite, even though he was born on the wrong side of the sheets. Because you were always going to hand him the empire I spent my entire life building myself, brick by brick, deal by deal, while he ran off falling in love with the daughter of your consigliere like some lovesick fool with no understanding of what it takes to actually run this family." His eyes, wild now, swept the table. "I removed Salvatore because he was a variable I could not control. I removed Elena because she was a weakness that would have made Dante soft, careless, unfit to lead. Everything I did to protect this family's future, from a bastard son who never deserved to inherit it in the first place." The silence that followed was absolute. For a long, suspended moment, no one in the dining hall moved. Then Dante was on his feet, his chair scraping back with a violence that sent it toppling to the marble floor, and the fury contorting his face was unlike anything Elena had ever witnessed. "You son of a bitch." His voice was a low, lethal thing, stripped of every civility that usually governed this family's dealings. "You destroyed her father. You drove her out of this house, believing her own family would be murdered if she stayed. You let me believe for 5 years that the woman I loved abandoned me for money. And you kept my son a secret from me for reasons that amount to nothing more than petty, greedy ambition." "Dante," Elena reached for his arm, some instinct urging caution even through her own blazing fury, but he was already moving around the table toward his brother, and Matteo, to his credit, or perhaps simply his arrogance, did not retreat. "Careful, brother," Matteo said, though his voice had lost its earlier bravado, thinning into something more desperate. "You wouldn't want to do anything rash in front of your son." The reminder landed like a slap. Dante froze, his fists clenched at his sides, chest heaving with barely restrained violence, and behind him, Elena scooped Nico into her arms, shielding his face against her shoulder as the boy began to whimper at the raised voices and sudden chaos filling the room. "It's okay, baby," she murmured against his hair, her heart breaking even as fury still coursed through her veins. "It's okay. We're going to be okay." Get them out of this room. Vincenzo's rasping voice cut through the chaos, weaker now, exhaustion clearly overtaking him, even as fury still burned in his ancient eyes. The boys should not witness this. Carmela appeared as if summoned, gently guiding Elena and Nico toward the door, but Elena paused at the threshold, looking back at the scene unfolding behind her. Dante and Matteo facing each other like two wolves circling a single kill. Vincenzo slumped in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 78 years and more, and around the table a dozen cousins and relatives watching with the horrified fascination of people witnessing an empire fracture in real time.
You will pay for what you did to her family, Dante said, low and deadly. And to mine. Will I?
Matteo's composure had returned, cold and calculating once more, some final, desperate gambit forming behind his eyes. Careful what you threaten, brother. I still control half this family's assets. I still have men loyal to me, men who owe their positions to my patronage, not yours. If you think Papa's deathbed confession is enough to strip me of everything I've built, you understand this family far less than you think you do. Is that a threat? Vincenzo's voice, though weakened, still carried the unmistakable authority of decades of command. In my own house, at my own table, on what may be my final night on this earth. Matteo's jaw tightened, some final calculation resolving behind his eyes. It's a fact, Papa. Whatever you decide tonight, whatever you write into that will your lawyer is undoubtedly drafting as we speak, I will not simply disappear quietly. I built half of what this family has today. I am not walking away from it because a bastard son finally managed to produce an heir before I did. Get out. Vincenzo's voice cracked like a whip, sudden strength surging through his ravaged frame. Get out of my house, Matteo. I will summon you when I have decided what is to be done with you. Until then, I do not want to look at your face. For a moment, Elena thought Matteo might refuse, might push the confrontation to its violent conclusion right there in the dining hall. But something in his father's eyes must have convinced him otherwise, because after a long, tense moment, he straightened his jacket, cast one final, unreadable glance toward Elena and the boy in her arms, and strode from the room without another word, his wife Camille hurrying after him with an expression of barely concealed panic. The dining hall exhaled as one collective breath once he was gone. But the tension that remained felt no less dangerous, merely redirected, coiled, waiting. This family, Vincenzo said, his voice suddenly terribly frail, has much to answer for. Tonight is only the beginning. He looked up, his dark eyes finding Elena across the ruins of the dinner that had never actually been served, and in them she saw something she had never expected to find in this house. Genuine, unmistakable remorse.
I am sorry, Elena Marchetti, the old Don said quietly, for what my family did to yours. It will not go unanswered. Elena did not sleep that night, not really. She lay in the massive guest bed with Nico curled against her side, his small body finally relaxed into the deep, uncomplicated sleep of childhood, while her own mind churned through everything that had unfolded at that table. Her father had been innocent. All those years of grief, of believing she'd somehow failed him by leaving, of wondering if his death had been some form of cosmic punishment for a sin she'd never fully understood, all of it had been built on Matteo Falcone's lies.
The rage that thought produced was so total, so consuming, that Elena found herself shaking silently in the dark, careful not to wake her son, tears soaking into the pillow beneath her cheek. A soft knock came at the door sometime past midnight. Elena eased herself carefully out from beside Nico, checked that he was still deeply asleep, and opened it to find Dante standing in the hallway, his jacket gone, his shirt sleeves rolled to the forearm, looking as exhausted and raw as she felt. "I couldn't sleep," he said quietly. "I thought you might be awake too." She stepped into the hallway, easing the door mostly closed behind her, and without quite deciding to do it, found herself stepping into his arms. He wrapped himself around her instantly, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other spread flat and warm against her spine, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "I should have protected you," Dante said finally, his voice muffled against her hair. "I should have seen what my own brother was capable of. I should have fought harder 5 years ago instead of believing the lies my mother fed me." "You didn't know." "I should have known." His arms tightened around her. "I let you disappear, Elena. I let 5 years pass without ever once trying hard enough to find you. I told myself I was respecting your choice to leave, but the truth is, I was a coward. I was angry and hurt, and I let that anger convince me it was easier to hate you than to keep searching for the truth." Elena pulled back enough to look up at his face, tracing the exhausted lines around his eyes with gentle fingers. "We were both cowards, in different ways. I ran because I was terrified. You stopped looking because it hurt too much to keep hoping." She pressed her palm flat against his chest, feeling the rapid, unsteady beat of his heart beneath her hand. "We can't get those 5 years back, Dante, but we don't have to lose any more." Something in his expression shifted, softened, and he leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, before his lips finally found hers. This kiss was different from the desperate, hungry one at the club, slower, deeper, an unspoken vow passing between them in the quiet dark of the hallway. "Marry me," he murmured against her lips when they finally broke apart. Helena's breath caught. "Dante, not tonight, not tomorrow even. Whenever you're ready, whenever it makes sense, whenever this family's chaos has settled enough that I can actually give you the wedding you deserve, instead of whatever disaster is currently unfolding downstairs." His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone, reverent and possessive all at once. "But I am asking, Eleanor. I want to marry you. I want to raise our son together, openly, without hiding, without lies. I want the whole world to know exactly who you are to me." Tears filled her eyes again, different tears this time, warmer, though no less overwhelming. "Ask me again," she whispered, "when this is over, when your brother has been dealt with, when your father—" Her voice broke slightly. "When there's peace in this house, instead of war." "There will be peace," Dante said, with a certainty that sent a chill down her spine, not fear, but recognition of exactly what kind of man he'd become in her absence, exactly what he was capable of when it came to protecting what was his. "I promise you that, Eleanor. Whatever it takes." From somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed softly, and Elena caught a glimpse of Sophia's silhouette disappearing around a corner, clearly having witnessed at least part of their exchange. Dante noticed too, his jaw tightening. "This family will be talking about tonight for years," he murmured. "Let them talk." Elena rose onto her toes, pressing one final, lingering kiss to his lips. "I'm done hiding, Dante. If your father's dying wish was to bring this whole rotten tree out into the light, then I intend to make sure the truth burns every last lie to the ground." Morning brought with it a summons to Vincenzo's study, not the sick room this time, but the formal office where, Elena imagined, decades of the family's darkest business had been conducted across a massive mahogany desk that looked older than the country itself. Vincenzo sat behind that desk now, propped upright with pillows, a manila folder resting before him thick enough to contain what Elena suspected was the entirety of the independent investigator's findings. Dante stood beside his father's chair, and across from them, seated stiffly in a leather armchair, was a man Elena didn't recognize. Mid-50s, sharp-suited, with the careful, unreadable expression of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news to dangerous people. "Elena," Vincenzo said, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Please, this concerns you as much as anyone in this family." She sat, glancing between Dante's grim expression and the stranger's professional neutrality. "Who is this?" "Marcus Webb," the man said, extending a hand she shook cautiously. "I'm the investigator He glanced at Vincenzo, uncertain of the correct term, "that Mr. Falcone hired 3 months ago. I've spent that time reconstructing the events of 5 years ago, and I believe it's important you hear the full extent of what I found, directly, rather than second-hand." Vincenzo nodded for him to continue, and Webb opened the folder, withdrawing a series of documents Elena didn't fully understand, but which Dante, beside her, scanned with the practiced eye of a man who'd clearly grown up understanding exactly this kind of paperwork. 5 years ago, Matteo Falcone began systematically constructing a case against Salvatore Marchetti, Webb said, his voice clinical, precise. He established a shell company in the Caymans, Whitmore Holdings, 18 months before the alleged betrayal occurred. He used that company to fund a series of payments that were later presented as evidence of Marchetti's collusion with the Bratva. He identified a Bratva-affiliated broker named Yuri Kozlov, paid him $400,000 over the course of 8 months, and coached him extensively on testimony designed to implicate Marchetti specifically. "Why," Elena said, her voice tight, "would a Russian broker agree to lie under oath about something that serious? Wasn't he putting himself at risk too?" Kozlov was already facing internal discipline from his own organization for a separate matter, skimming, essentially, from his own people. Matteo offered him not just money, but protection, an arrangement to relocate to Miami under a new identity with enough capital to start fresh. From Kozlov's perspective, it was a lifeline. From everyone else's, it was a devastatingly effective lie. Elena's hands had curled into fists in her lap. "And my father never knew any of this. Your father believed, until the day he was accused, that he was simply serving this family loyally, as he had for 20 years. Webb's expression softened marginally. The meetings he attended, the ones later used as evidence against him, were arranged by an intermediary who told him they were sanctioned business discussions on Vincenzo's behalf. He had no reason to suspect otherwise. He was, by every measure I could find in 8 weeks of investigation, entirely innocent." Vincenzo's hand, resting on the desk, had begun to tremble. Not from illness this time, Elena suspected, but from a fury that had nowhere left to go except inward, curdling into something like self-loathing. "I destroyed a good man," he said quietly, "because my own son wanted an inheritance faster than I intended to give it to him." "There's more," Webb said, and something in his tone made Elena's stomach drop even further. The night Elena left this house, the confrontation between her and Matteo was not, according to phone records and financial transactions I've traced, a single spontaneous threat. Matteo had been planning her removal for several weeks prior. He'd identified her as a variable that threatened his position the moment he learned Dante intended to propose. The photographs he showed her weren't merely leverage. They were doctored, digitally altered images designed specifically to convince her of a threat that, at that time, didn't yet fully exist. "He fabricated evidence to manipulate me into leaving," Elena said slowly, the full scope of the betrayal settling over her like ice water. "Everything he told me that night, all of it, from the start, was a lie, constructed purely to get me out of this family before I could threaten his position." "Based on what I've found, yes." Webb closed the folder gently. "I'm sorry. I know that's not an easy thing to hear 5 years later." Dante's hand found Elena's shoulder, gripping hard enough that she could feel the barely restrained violence trembling beneath his controlled exterior. "It ends today," he said, his voice a low, lethal promise. "Whatever my father decides to do about the business side of this, Matteo answers to me personally for what he did to Elena." "Dante." Vincenzo's voice, though weak, carried enough authority to cut through his son's fury. "There will be justice, I promise you that. But it will be done properly, within the structures of this family, not through rash violence that only creates new enemies. I have made enough mistakes in this life. I will not make the mistake of letting my own grief and fury dictate my final decisions as head of this family." While Vincenzo and Dante remained closeted with Webb, working through the legal and financial implications of what the investigation had uncovered, Elena found herself wandering the mansion's grounds with Nico, desperate for air, for space, for a moment to process everything that had unravelled in less than 24 hours. The gardens behind the house stretched down toward a small artificial lake, autumn leaves scattered across manicured paths that Elena remembered walking with Dante 5 years ago, back when the world had felt simpler, before betrayal and grief had reshaped everything she thought she understood about love and family. "Mummy, look!" Nico had found a particularly impressive pile of leaves and was in the process of demolishing it with gleeful abandon. "I'm a leaf monster!" "I can see that, baby." Elena managed a genuine smile, despite everything churning beneath the surface, watching her son's uncomplicated joy with the fierce, protective love that had defined every day of the past 4 years. A shadow fell across the path, and Elena turned, every muscle in her body tensing, before she recognized Camille, Matteo's wife, standing several feet away with an expression Elena couldn't quite read, somewhere between hostility and desperate calculation. "Elena?" Camille's voice was cool, controlled, though something brittle lurked beneath the surface. "I wanted to speak with you before things escalate any further." "I'm not sure there's anything left to say, Camille." "There is." Camille glanced toward Nico, still gleefully scattering leaves several yards away, before returning her attention to Elena. "You should know that my children, Matteo's children, have nothing to do with what he's done. Sophia is 14, Marco is 11. They didn't ask to be born into whatever scheme their father constructed, and if Vincenzo strips Matteo of everything, if this becomes some kind of family war,
They're the ones who'll suffer for it, along with the rest of us. Elena studied the other woman carefully, trying to determine whether this was genuine maternal fear or simply another manipulation designed to soften the consequences her husband so clearly deserved. "I understand you're afraid for your children, Camille. I am too. I have been for 4 years, hiding my son from a family I believed would destroy him the moment they learned he existed. But I'm not the one who orchestrated any of this. Your husband destroyed my father's reputation and drove him to his death. He manufactured evidence to tear apart the man I loved. He kept my son a secret from his own grandfather for 4 years through his lies. Whatever consequences he faces now, he built them himself, brick by brick, exactly as he built everything else in this family." Camille's composed expression cracked slightly, real fear bleeding through. "Do you have children, Elena? Truly understand what it means to watch everything you've built for them threatened by something entirely outside your control?" "I have a son," Elena said quietly, "who I raised alone for 4 years because I believed this family would kill him, or worse, if they ever learned he existed. So yes, Camille, I understand exactly what that fear feels like." Something in Camille's face shifted, some genuine recognition passing between two women who, despite everything, understood the particular terror of motherhood in a world this dangerous. "Then help me," Camille said, her voice dropping to something almost pleading. "Talk to Dante. Talk to Vincenzo. Whatever punishment Matteo deserves, ask them to spare my children from the consequences of his choices." Before Elena could respond, a sharp cry cut through the autumn air. Nico's voice, suddenly panicked, and Elena's entire body flooded with adrenaline as she spun toward the sound. Her son had wandered further than she'd realized, down toward the edge of the artificial lake, and standing over him, gripping his small arm with a hand that was clearly too tight, was a man Elena didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, expensively dressed, with the particular blank, professional demeanor of hired muscle. "Nico!" Elena was running before conscious thought fully caught up, adrenaline screaming through her veins as she closed the distance between herself and her son. "Mrs. Marchetti," the man said calmly, not releasing Nico's arm. "Mr. Matteo Falcone would like a word. He's asked that the boy accompany you." Every instinct Elena possessed screamed at her to fight, to scream, to do whatever necessary to get her son away from the stranger's grip. But some cold, clear-headed part of her recognized that panic here could get Nico hurt. "Let go of my son," she said, forcing her voice into something calm and authoritative, despite the terror clawing at her throat. "Or I will make sure Vincenzo Falcone knows exactly whose orders you're following the moment I reach the house." The man's grip on Nico's arm loosened marginally, uncertainty flickering across his professional mask, and in that moment of hesitation, Elena closed the final distance and pulled her son firmly against her side, positioning her own body between him and the stranger. "You don't want to do this," Elena said, her voice hardening despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "Whatever Matteo is paying you, it's not worth what will happen to you if you touch my son again." "Ma'am, I'm just following instructions." "Elena!" Dante's voice cut across the garden like a gunshot, and Elena turned to see him sprinting down the path from the house, several other men in dark suits close behind him, his expression contorted with a fury Elena had never witnessed in him before. "Get away from her!"
The stranger released whatever grip remained on Nico entirely, stepping back with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender that did nothing to slow Dante's furious advance. Within seconds, Dante had reached them, sweeping Elena and Nico both into the protective circle of his arms, his whole body trembling with barely restrained rage. "Are you hurt? Either of you?" His hands moved over Nico with frantic, careful precision, checking for injury even as the boy, thoroughly frightened now, began to cry. "We're okay," Elena managed, though her own voice shook badly. "He grabbed Nico's arm, but I don't think—" "Who sent you?" Dante's voice had dropped to something low and utterly lethal, directed at the stranger, who had gone pale despite his considerable size advantage. "Speak, or I promise you will not enjoy the alternative." "Mr. Matteo Falcone," the man said quickly. "He said his father wanted the boy brought to the house, that it was urgent. My father has said nothing of the sort." Dante's men had surrounded the stranger now, and Elena watched with a sick mixture of relief and horror as they escorted him roughly away, his protests fading into the distance. Camille had gone white as bone, her hand pressed against her mouth in genuine, unmistakable shock. "I didn't know," she said, her voice shaking. "Elena, I swear to you, I had no idea he would do something like this." "I believe you," Elena said, though her attention remained fixed on Nico, who had buried his face against her shoulder, small body trembling with residual fear. "But your husband just tried to have my son taken from me by force, in broad daylight, on his father's own property." "Whatever loyalty you still feel toward him, Camille, I hope you understand exactly what kind of man you're protecting." Dante guided them back toward the house, one arm wrapped protectively around Elena's shoulders, his expression a mask of controlled violence that promised very bad things for his brother. Nico had quieted somewhat, though he clung to his mother with a desperate grip that broke Elena's heart all over again. "This ends now," Dante said, his voice low and final as they climbed the steps back into the mansion. "Whatever mercy my father intended to show Matteo, he just forfeited it entirely." They found Vincenzo still in his study, and the moment he took in Elena's shaking hands, Nico's tear-streaked face, and the murderous fury radiating off his eldest son, the old Don's expression transformed into something ancient and terrible. "Tell me," he said, his rasping voice suddenly, frighteningly clear. Dante recounted what had happened in short, clipped sentences, each word seeming to age his father further, the old man's face collapsing into an expression of grief and fury so profound that Elena found herself, despite everything, feeling a stab of genuine pity for him. "He tried to take my great-grandson," Vincenzo said quietly when Dante had finished, "by force. From his own mother, to use as leverage against this family he has already betrayed beyond forgiveness." His trembling hand reached for the telephone on his desk. "Bring him to me, now. I do not care what he is doing or where he is. Bring Matteo Falcone to my study within the hour, or I will send men to drag him here myself." Matteo arrived 40 minutes later, escorted by 4 of Dante's men, with a lack of ceremony that made his diminished status brutally clear. Gone was the smooth, gracious host of the night before. In his place stood a man whose careful composure had finally entirely cracked, revealing something desperate and cornered beneath. "Papa, whatever they've told you, you tried to take the boy." Vincenzo said, his voice quiet in a way that was somehow more terrifying than any shout could have been. By force, from his mother, on my own property, using my own name as justification.
I only meant to bring him for a conversation. Do not lie to me again. Vincenzo's voice cracked like a whip, sudden fury animating his ravaged frame. You have lied to me for 5 years, Matteo. You destroyed an innocent man's reputation, orphaned a child, drove your own brother's love away from this house through manufactured evidence and manipulation. And now, faced with the consequences of your own choices, you attempted to kidnap a 4-year-old child to use as a bargaining chip. He rose slowly from his chair, refusing the nurse's hand that reached to steady him, standing on his own trembling legs to face his younger son directly. I have spent 78 years building this family's power, Matteo. I have made choices in that time that I am not proud of. Decisions that cost good men their lives, their reputations, their futures. But I have never, in all those years, harmed a child to protect my own interests. That is a line I did not believe any Falcone would cross, and you crossed it without hesitation. Matteo's composure finally fully shattered. Everything I did for this family, for its future, its strength. Dante was never suited to lead. He's too soft, too sentimental, exactly the kind of weakness that gets men killed in this business. I removed the variables that threatened this family's stability. I built alliances, secured territories, expanded our holdings by 40% in the past 5 years alone, while Dante played house with a woman who compromised his judgment at every turn. You will not, Dante said, his voice a low, lethal growl, speak about Elena in my presence. Why not? Matteo rounded on his brother, some final, desperate mask falling away entirely. She's the reason we're standing here right now, isn't she? If she'd simply stayed gone, if her bastard child had remained hidden as intended, none of this would have unravelled. I would still be running this family's operations, exactly as I have been for years, exactly as I am better suited to do than you ever will be. You are not suited to lead anything, Vincenzo said, his voice suddenly terribly final, except perhaps a prison cell, which is precisely where you are headed if the authorities ever learn what I now know about Yuri Kozlov's testimony and the fabricated evidence used to destroy Salvatore Marchetti's life. The room went utterly silent. Matteo's face had drained of all colour. You wouldn't, he said, his voice suddenly small. Papa, you wouldn't turn your own son over to the authorities. I am dying, Matteo. Vincenzo's voice, though weak, carried absolute conviction. I have perhaps weeks left, perhaps only days. What I choose to do with those remaining days will define this family's legacy for generations to come. I will not spend my final breaths protecting a son who tried to kidnap a child, who destroyed an innocent man's life for greed, who has proven himself entirely unfit to bear the Falcone name. His dark eyes, ancient and unforgiving, held his younger son's gaze. You are stripped of every position within this family's operations, effective immediately. Your access to family accounts is revoked. Your name is removed from every board, every partnership, every holding this family controls.
You will be permitted to keep your personal residence and a modest allowance sufficient to support your wife and children, provided you never again attempt contact with Elena, with Dante, or with my great-grandson. And if I refuse to simply disappear quietly, then I will personally ensure that every allied family in this city learns exactly what you did to Salvatore Marchetti, Vincenzo said, his voice hardening into something that reminded Elena, despite everything, exactly why this man had commanded such fear and respect for decades. I will ensure that the authorities receive an anonymous tip regarding Yuri Kozlov's whereabouts and the payments that secured his false testimony. I will ensure that every door in this world, legitimate or otherwise, closes to you permanently. You have a choice, Matteo. Disappear quietly into whatever remains of your diminished life, or watch everything, truly everything, burn to the ground around you. Matteo stood frozen for a long, agonizing moment, calculation and fury warring visibly across his face. Finally, something in him seemed to collapse entirely, his shoulders slumping as 5 years of carefully constructed ambition crumbled to dust in front of the family he'd tried to control. "Fine," he said, his voice hollow. "Fine. You win, Papa, as you always do." He turned and left without another word, without a backward glance, and Elena watched him go with a strange, hollow feeling that was neither triumph nor pity, but something more complicated than either. The days that followed Matteo's exile passed in a strange, suspended quality, the mansion settling into an uneasy quiet after the storm of revelation and confrontation that had upended 5 years of buried lies in the space of a single dinner. Elena found herself almost against her will, growing accustomed to the rhythms of a house she'd once believed would never truly welcome her. Carmela, the elderly housekeeper, had taken an immediate, fierce liking to Nico, sneaking him extra desserts and teaching him simple Italian phrases that he repeated with delighted enthusiasm at every opportunity. Isabella, Dante's great-aunt, had softened considerably once the truth of Matteo's betrayal became clear, seeking Elena out for quiet conversations that felt less like interrogations and more, gradually, like genuine attempts at reconciliation. "Your father was a good man," Isabella told her one afternoon, the two of them sharing tea in the mansion's sunroom while Nico napped upstairs. "I knew him for 15 years, Elena. He never once gave me reason to doubt his loyalty. I should have questioned the evidence against him more carefully. We all should have." "It's done now," Elena said, though the grief still sat heavy and unresolved in her chest. "I can't get those years back. I can't undo what happened to him." "No," Isabella agreed gently, "but you can ensure his memory is restored properly within this family, and that his grandson grows up knowing the truth of who his grandfather really was. Not the lie Matteo constructed, but the loyal man he actually was." Vincenzo, weakening by the day, despite the medical team that now attended him around the clock, had insisted on spending time with Nico every afternoon, a ritual that had quickly become the highlight of both their days. Elena watched from the doorway one afternoon as the old Don, propped up against a mountain of pillows, listened with rapt attention to Nico's elaborate, entirely fictional account of a dinosaur battle, occasionally offering commentary that made the boy giggle with delight. "He is a good boy," Vincenzo said to her later, once Nico had been ushered off for his nap. "Fearless, curious, kind. You have raised him well, Elena, despite everything this family put you through." "Thank you." Elena settled into the chair beside his bed,
watching the old man's ravaged face with a complicated mixture of lingering resentment and something that had grown, against all odds, into genuine respect. "I want to ask you something, if I may." "Ask." "Why did you wait? You said you'd known for 3 months that my father was innocent. Why summon the entire family for this dinner instead of simply correcting the record privately?" Vincenzo was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes distant, weighing decades of accumulated wisdom and regret. "Because I am dying, Elena, and I did not want to leave this world, with my family still built on a foundation of lies. I wanted every person who had judged you, who had judged your father, who had participated in the destruction of an innocent man's reputation, to witness the truth together, all at once, so that no one could pretend afterward not to have known." He reached for her hand, his grip weak but earnest. "And because I hoped, selfishly perhaps, that bringing everyone together for one final dinner might give my son a chance to reclaim what Matteo had stolen from him, a chance at happiness, at family, at the kind of love that outlasts even the worst betrayals." Eleanor's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "You could have simply told him the truth, privately." "I am an old man, and I have made many mistakes in my life," Vincenzo said, his voice growing tired. "But I have learned, in my final months, that some truths must be spoken aloud, in front of witnesses, or they risk being buried again by those who benefit from silence. Matteo would have found some way to minimize his guilt, to twist the narrative, if I had simply told Dante privately. By bringing it into the light, in front of the entire family, I ensured the truth could not be undone again." He squeezed her hand once more, before exhaustion overtook him, his eyes drifting closed, and Elena sat with him in silence for a long while, watching the rise and fall of his laboured breathing, feeling something shift inside her chest that she hadn't expected. A fragile, tentative forgiveness for a man who had, in his own complicated way, tried to make right what his family had broken. That evening, Dante found her in the garden, where Nico had built his leaf monster days earlier, the autumn air growing colder now as the season shifted toward winter. "How is he?" Dante asked, settling beside her on the stone bench. "Tired. Fading, I think. Faster than the doctors expected." Elena leaned into his shoulder, allowing herself for the first time in years the simple comfort of being held. "He told me why he arranged all this, the dinner, the confrontation, all of it. And I think," Elena said slowly, "that despite everything this family did to us, your father genuinely wanted to make it right before he ran out of time to do so." Dante pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his arms tightening around her. "Then let's make sure his final wish comes true," he murmured. "Let's give him the family reunited before it's too late." But peace, Elena would learn, rarely arrived without complications, and the fragile equilibrium that had settled over the mansion in the weeks following Matteo's exile was shattered one grey November morning by a phone call that sent the entire household into renewed chaos. Dante had been in the study, reviewing documents with Vincenzo's lawyer regarding the formal restructuring of the family's holdings, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Elena,
sitting nearby with Nico working through a colouring book at her side, watched his expression shift from mild irritation to something far more alarming as the call progressed. "When?" His voice had gone tight, controlled in the particular way she now recognised meant genuine danger. "And you're certain it was him?" A pause, his jaw working. "Understood. Keep me informed." He ended the call and sat in silence for a long moment, staring at nothing, before finally meeting Elena's questioning gaze. "That was one of my men in the city," Dante said carefully. "Matteo was seen meeting with representatives from the Vitale family 2 nights ago. A rival house, one my father has maintained a fragile peace with for over a decade." Elena's stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" "It means my brother, having lost his position within this family, may be attempting to secure allies outside it." Dante's expression had hardened into something cold and calculating. The man Elena had glimpsed in flashes since her return, finally emerging fully. "It means we may not be done dealing with Matteo, despite my father's attempt to simply exile him quietly." Vincenzo, informed of the development within the hour, received the news with a grim, weary resignation that spoke to just how thoroughly Matteo's betrayal had exhausted whatever paternal patience remained in him. "The Vitale family has long coveted our shipping routes along the eastern seaboard," Vincenzo said, propped up in his study chair, looking more frail with each passing day. "If Matteo is offering them information, access, anything of value in exchange for their support, he may be attempting to position himself for some kind of retaliation." "What kind of retaliation?" Elena asked, fear coiling tight in her chest at the implications for Nico's safety. "A challenge to Dante's succession, most likely," Vincenzo said grimly. "Or something more direct. Matteo has shown he is willing to cross lines I did not believe any of my sons capable of crossing. I would not put violence past him if he believes it is his only remaining path to power." Dante's expression had gone stone cold, calculating in a way that reminded Elena uncomfortably exactly what world she had brought her son back into. "I'll increase security around the estate immediately. Elena and Nico do not leave this property without at least 3 men accompanying them, effective today." "Dante, I'm not negotiating on this, Elena." His voice, though not unkind, carried an absolute finality that brooked no argument. "My brother has already attempted to take our son once. I will not risk a second attempt succeeding because I underestimated how far he's willing to go." That night, unable to sleep despite Nico's peaceful presence beside her, Elena found herself wrestling with a fear that went beyond simple physical danger, a deeper anxiety about the world she had brought her son into, the violence and calculation that seemed to underpin every relationship in this family, even the loving ones. She found Dante in his own suite down the hall, still awake, reviewing security reports with the grim focus of a man preparing for war. "Talk to me," she said, settling onto the arm of his chair. "Really talk to me, Dante. Is this the life you want for Nico? For us? Constant threat, constant vigilance, always looking over our shoulders for the next betrayal?" Dante set aside the reports, his expression softening as he studied her face. "I won't lie to you and pretend this world is safe, Eleanor. It never has been, not for my family, not for centuries. But I can promise you this. I will spend every resource I have, every alliance, every ounce of power this family commands, ensuring that Nico grows up protected, secure, never once doubting that he is loved and safe." He reached for her hand, his grip warm and certain. I know this isn't the life you dreamed of for him, but I also know that running from this world entirely isn't truly possible. Not when he carries this family's blood, this family's name. The best I can offer is to make this world as safe as it can possibly be for both of you. Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, weighing everything. The danger, the complicated history, the undeniable love that had never truly faded despite 5 years of separation and grief. "Then we face it together," she said finally. "Whatever comes next with Matteo, whatever this family's world demands of us. Together, Dante. Not hidden away, not pretending we're something we're not." His answering smile was small, tired, but genuine. "Together," he agreed, pulling her down into his lap, wrapping his arms around her with a fierce, protective tenderness. "I promise you, Eleanor, whatever it takes." The attack came 3 days later, swift and violent in a way that shattered the mansion's fragile sense of security in an instant. Eleanor had taken Nico for a rare outing beyond the estate's walls, a small, carefully guarded trip to a nearby park that Dante had reluctantly approved, insisting on 4 armed men accompanying them at a discreet distance. It was meant to be a small mercy, a chance for Nico to simply be a normal 4-year-old for an hour, playing on swings and slides without the oppressive weight of mansion walls surrounding him. They were halfway through a game of tag near the park's small playground when Elena heard it. The distinctive screech of tyres, too close, too fast. And instinct born of 5 years spent instinctively scanning for danger, sent her lunging for Nico before conscious thought fully caught up. "Down!" she screamed, tackling her son to the ground behind a wooden play structure as the first gunshots cracked through the afternoon air. Chaos erupted around them. Dante's men returning fire, other parents in the park screaming and scattering, Nico's terrified cries mixing with the deafening percussion of gunfire that seemed to stretch on for an eternity, though it likely lasted only seconds. Elena curled her body entirely around her son's, shielding him with everything she had, praying with a desperate, wordless intensity that neither of them would feel the impact of a bullet. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The screech of tyres again, retreating this time, and the sudden, ringing silence that followed gunfire's abrupt cessation. "Mrs. Marchetti!" One of Dante's men was beside them instantly, his own weapon still drawn, scanning the surrounding area with tense, professional focus. "Are you hit? Is the boy hurt?" Elena pulled back enough to examine Nico with frantic, trembling hands, checking every inch of his small body for injury, even as sobs of pure terror racked his tiny frame. "We're okay," she managed, her own voice shaking badly. "We're okay, I think. Oh God, we're okay." The drive back to the estate passed in a blur of adrenaline and delayed shock, Nico clinging to her with a desperate grip that broke her heart anew with every trembling breath. By the time they arrived, Dante was already waiting at the entrance, having received word of the attack, his face a mask of barely controlled terror that transformed into fierce, protective fury the moment he laid eyes on them both, safe and shaking, but unharmed. "Elena." He crossed the distance between them in seconds, pulling both her and Nico into an embrace so tight it nearly crushed the air from her lungs. "God, Elena, I thought... we're okay," she whispered against his chest, her own composure finally beginning to crumble now that the immediate danger had passed. "We're okay, Dante. But someone tried to—" "I know." His voice had gone hard, lethal, all trace of the fear from moments earlier replaced by an icy, focused rage. "One of my men caught a partial plate. We're already tracing it." Within the hour, the answer arrived with grim, inevitable certainty. The vehicle belonged to a shell company, with financial ties tracing directly back to Matteo Falcone. "He tried to have them killed," Dante said, his voice a low, deadly whisper, as he stood before his father's bed that evening, Vincenzo's condition having worsened noticeably in the wake of the day's stress. "My own brother tried to have my son murdered in a public park." "Or," Vincenzo said weakly, "he intended only to frighten, to send a message, and the attack simply went further than planned. Either possibility is equally damning." "I don't care about the distinction, Papa." Dante's hands had curled into fists at his sides. "He crossed a line today that cannot be uncrossed. I am done showing him mercy for your sake." Vincenzo was silent for a long moment, his ancient eyes weighing decades of accumulated wisdom against the fresh grief of watching his own family tear itself apart from within. "Do what you believe you must, Dante," he said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion and something that might have been resignation. "I am too tired and too close to the end of my own time to continue protecting a son who has proven himself willing to murder a child for power. Whatever justice you decide to pursue, I will not stand in your way." Elena, standing in the doorway with Nico finally mercifully asleep in her arms after hours of soothing and reassurance, felt a cold certainty settle over her. That whatever came next in this war between brothers, it would not end quietly, and it would not end without more blood being spilled, before the truth of this family's cycle of violence and betrayal finally, fully resolved itself. Dante moved with a cold, methodical fury in the days that followed the attack, mobilizing every resource the Falcone family commanded to locate his brother before Matteo could attempt a second strike. Elena watched him transform, hour by hour, into something she recognized from old stories about the family's darker history. Not the tender, careful father who had knelt to speak gently with his son, but the ruthless heir Vincenzo had spent decades grooming him to become. "We found him," Dante told her 3 days later, his expression grim with satisfaction as he entered the room where she sat, watching Nico play with a set of toy dinosaurs, a small, precious normalcy amid the chaos. A safe house in New Jersey, courtesy of his new friends in the Vitale family. "What happens now?" "Now," Dante said, his voice carrying an edge that sent a chill down her spine, "my father makes a decision, and I ensure it's carried out." That decision came the following morning, delivered from Vincenzo's sickbed with the weary finality of a man who had exhausted every reserve of paternal mercy he'd once possessed. "Bring him to me," the old Don said, his voice barely above a whisper now, strength fading by the day. "I will look my son in the eye one final time before I decide his fate." The confrontation, when it came, took place not in the grand dining hall, but in the quiet intimacy of Vincenzo's bedroom, Matteo brought before his dying father under heavy guard, his earlier bravado entirely stripped away by days spent as a fugitive from his own family. "Papa." Matteo's voice cracked with something that might have been genuine fear now.
the reality of his situation finally fully sinking in. "Whatever you've heard about the park, I swear to you, I never intended—" "Do not lie to me with what little time remains between us," Vincenzo said, his voice weak but utterly without warmth. "You ordered an attack on a public playground, endangering the life of your own nephew, all children present, dozens of innocent bystanders, in a desperate attempt to eliminate the heir who has replaced you. There is no version of events that makes this forgivable, Matteo." "I only meant to frighten them." "Enough." Vincenzo's voice, though barely above a rasp, carried enough authority to silence his son instantly. "I have spent 78 years building an empire, and in that time I have made peace with many terrible things. Violence, betrayal, the cost of power in a world that demands blood as its currency. But I have never made peace with harming children, and I will not begin now, in the final days of my life, by showing mercy to a son who tried to murder his own family's future." Elena, standing at the back of the room with Dante beside her, watched Matteo's face crumble entirely. 5 years of careful ambition and ruthless calculation finally completely collapsing into raw, desperate fear. "Papa, please, whatever punishment you intend, consider my children. Sophia and Marco had nothing to do with this." "Your children will be provided for," Vincenzo said, his voice softening marginally at the mention of his grandchildren, the only trace of tenderness remaining in his ravaged expression. "Camille will retain custody. A modest trust will ensure their education and basic needs are met. But you, Matteo, you will face the consequences of what you have done, fully, without further mercy from this family." "What consequences?" Matteo's voice had gone thin with terror. Vincenzo's dark eyes, ancient and unyielding, held his son's gaze for a long, final moment. "You will be handed over to the authorities, along with the evidence Marcus Webb has compiled regarding Salvatore Marchetti's wrongful persecution, the fabricated testimony of Yuri Kozlov, and the attempted murder of a child in a public park 3 days ago. You will face justice, Matteo, in whatever form the law deems appropriate. I will not use this family's resources or influence to shield you from the consequences of your own choices. Not this time, not ever again." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Matteo's ragged, disbelieving breathing as the full weight of his father's decision settled over him. "You're condemning your own son," Matteo whispered. "You condemned yourself," Vincenzo said, his voice fading now with exhaustion. "The moment you decided a child's life was worth less than your own ambition. I am simply ensuring that the consequences finally, fully arrive." He gestured weakly toward the guards flanking the door, and Matteo was led away, his protests growing fainter as he was escorted from the room, from the house, from the family that had finally, decisively, cast him out. Not through exile this time, but through the full, unforgiving weight of justice long delayed. In the weeks that followed Matteo's arrest, orchestrated quietly through anonymous tips to federal authorities that ensured the Falcone family's own involvement remained carefully obscured, a strange, cautious peace began to settle over the mansion, though grief hovered close behind it like a persistent shadow. Vincenzo was fading now, undeniably, the medical team's careful optimism giving way to quiet, resigned acknowledgement that the old Don's remaining time could be measured in days rather than weeks. Elena found herself in this strange final chapter, spending increasing amounts of time at his bedside,
Nico often perched beside her, the old man's failing eyes brightening whenever his great-grandson entered the room.
"I want to see it," Vincenzo said one grey December afternoon, his voice barely a whisper now, oxygen tube taped carefully beneath his nose. "Before I go, I want to see my son married properly, the family united, the future secured." Dante, seated on the other side of the bed, exchanged a glance with Elena that carried the weight of an unspoken conversation they'd been circling for weeks. "Papa, there's no need to rush. There is every need," Vincenzo interrupted, with a flash of his old, formidable authority. "I do not have the luxury of waiting for the perfect moment, Dante. I have perhaps days left in this world, and I would very much like to spend one of them watching you marry the woman you should have married 5 years ago, if this family had not conspired to tear you apart." Elena's eyes filled with sudden tears, the weight of the old man's request settling over her with unexpected force. She looked to Dante, finding in his dark eyes the same fierce, unwavering love she'd first glimpsed 5 years ago, tempered now by everything they'd survived together and separately in the years since. "Elena." Dante slid from his chair, kneeling beside the bed in a gesture that struck her as almost unbearably tender, given everything they'd endured. "I know this isn't the proposal either of us imagined. I know we said we'd wait until things had settled, until the danger had passed entirely. But my father is asking for one thing before he leaves this world. And I find myself wanting exactly the same thing he does. To marry you, properly. Surrounded by whatever family we have left before we lose any more time to circumstances beyond our control." He reached into his jacket, producing a small velvet box that he must have been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment. "Marry me, Elena, not eventually, not when it's convenient, today, tomorrow, as soon as we can arrange it. Give my father this piece before it's too late." The ring inside the box was simple, elegant, nothing like the ostentatious jewellery Elena had expected from a family of this wealth. A single, perfect diamond set in gold. The kind of ring a man chose when he understood exactly what mattered to the woman he loved. "Yes," Elena said, through tears that had finally fully broken free. "Yes, Dante. Today, tomorrow, whenever we can manage it, yes." The wedding, when it came together 3 days later, was a strange, beautiful, hurried affair. A small ceremony in the mansion's garden, despite the December chill. Vincenzo wheeled out in a specially arranged chair, bundled against the cold, his face alight with a joy Elena hadn't imagined the formidable old Don capable of expressing. Nico served as ring-bearer, taking his responsibility with an earnest solemnity that made several of the assembled family members, Isabella, Carmela, even a handful of cousins who had witnessed the chaos of recent weeks, with growing sympathy for Elena's plight, dab at unexpected tears. Elena wore a simple ivory dress, nothing elaborate, understanding that the ceremony's meaning lay not in extravagance, but in the sheer, hard-won fact of its existence, proof that love, however battered by betrayal and separation, could still triumph against the machinations of those who sought to destroy it. "Do you, Dante Falcone, take this woman?" The priest's words seemed to Elena almost secondary to the look in Dante's eyes as he said his vows. A look that carried 5 years of grief and longing, finally, fully resolved into certainty, into permanence, into the unshakable promise of a future they had both once believed impossible. "I do," Dante said, his voice rough with emotion he made no effort to hide. When Elena spoke her own vows moments later, she felt Vincenzo's eyes on her from his wheelchair, watching with quiet, exhausted satisfaction as the family he had built, broken and finally begun to heal, witnessed the restoration of something precious that his own choices had once nearly destroyed forever. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." The kiss that followed was soft, reverent, a promise sealed in front of witnesses who had once condemned them both, and as Elena pulled back to find Dante's eyes shining with unshed tears, she understood that whatever darkness still lingered in this family's history, they had finally, truly, found their way back to each other. Vincenzo Falcone died 6 days after his son's wedding, peacefully, in his own bed, surrounded by the family he had spent his final months working desperately to reunite and restore. Elena had been at his bedside that final morning, Nico curled asleep in a chair beside her, when the old Don's breathing began to slow, each breath more laboured than the last, until finally, quietly, it simply stopped altogether. Dante arrived moments later, summoned by the nurse's urgent call, and together they sat with the body of the man who had, in his final months, transformed from the architect of their separation's aftermath into an unlikely agent of their reconciliation. "He knew," Dante said quietly, holding his father's cooling hand, his own eyes bright with grief he made no attempt to hide. He knew he was running out of time, and he spent every remaining day trying to fix what Matteo had broken. "He was trying to atone," Elena said softly, understanding now, in this final moment, the full weight of what the old Don had accomplished in his last months of life. Not just uncovering the truth of Matteo's betrayal, but ensuring that the family's future, embodied in Nico's small, sleeping form, would grow up knowing love, rather than the calculated cruelty that had defined so much of this family's history. The funeral, held 5 days later, drew mourners from every corner of the underworld the Falcone family had touched across 5 decades of influence. Allied families, business partners, politicians whose careers had been quietly shaped by Falcone patronage over the years. Elena stood beside Dante throughout the long, formal service, Nico's small hand clutched in hers, watching as the family that had once rejected her utterly now looked to her and to her son as the embodiment of whatever future remained for the Falcone name. "He would be proud," Isabella told Elena quietly after the service had concluded, the two women standing together at the edge of the family plot where Vincenzo now rested beside 3 generations of Falcone ancestors. "Of what you've built with Dante. Of the boy you've raised. Whatever mistakes this family made in the past, Elena, you and Nico represent its redemption." "I hope so." Elena watched Nico, standing solemnly beside his father, small hand clutched in Dante's much larger one, both of them gazing at the fresh grave with matching expressions of grief that spoke to exactly how thoroughly Vincenzo had woven himself into their small family's fabric in his final months. "I hope he found peace at the end, knowing what he'd fixed, even if he couldn't undo everything that came before." In the weeks that followed the funeral, Dante assumed formal leadership of the Falcone family's operations, a transition that proceeded with far less turbulence than might have been expected given the chaos of recent months.
Matteo's arrest and subsequent conviction, federal prosecutors, working from the evidence quietly provided through anonymous channels, had secured a lengthy sentence for fraud, conspiracy, and the attempted murder charges stemming from the park attack, had removed the primary obstacle to Dante's undisputed succession, and the family's various branches, having witnessed the full extent of Matteo's betrayal, rallied behind their new patriarch with a unity that surprised even Elena. "You did this," Dante told her one evening. The two of them settled together in what had once been Vincenzo's study, but now bore Dante's own careful reorganization, family photographs beginning to replace the formal portraits of dead ancestors that had once dominated the mansion's walls. "Not just by surviving what my family put you through, but by giving Papa the reason he needed to finally set things right before he died. Without you and Nico, I don't know if he would have found the strength to expose Matteo's betrayal at all." "We did this together," Elena corrected gently, settling into his lap with the easy familiarity of a marriage still new, but already deeply rooted. "You, me, your father, even Nico in his own small way. This family needed the truth to finally surface, whatever the cost, and I think we all played our part in making sure it finally did." Outside the study window, snow had begun to fall over the mansion's grounds, the first proper storm of winter transforming the gardens where Nico had once built his leaf monster into something soft and quiet and peaceful. Elena watched it fall, feeling, for the first time in 5 years, something like genuine, unguarded hope for the future stretching ahead of her small family. 6 months later, on a warm Sunday afternoon in late spring, Elena stood in the mansion's grand dining hall, watching as the extended Falcone family gathered once more around the long table where, less than a year ago, an entire empire of lies had finally come crashing down. Everything felt different now. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows rather than the cold, oppressive atmosphere she remembered from her first terrifying dinner in this house years ago. Isabella sat near the head of the table, engaged in animated conversation with Carmela about a recipe for the evening's meal. Cousins from Chicago and Providence mingled easily, the wariness and calculation that had once defined every family gathering, replaced by something that, if not quite ordinary warmth, at least resembled genuine affection. At the head of the table, where Vincenzo had once presided with formidable authority, Dante now sat in his father's old chair, though he'd insisted on smaller changes. Brighter linens, fresh flowers, instead of the sombre floral arrangements Elena remembered from years past, small details that marked this family as something being actively rebuilt rather than simply preserved in amber. "Mummy, watch!" Nico, now 4.5, had commandeered the attention of several younger cousins with an elaborate story about a dinosaur that lived in the mansion's basement. His imagination as boundless and fearless as ever, entirely unburdened by the dark history that had once threatened to consume his very existence before he was even born. Elena settled into her seat beside Dante, watching her son hold court among his new extended family, with the easy confidence of a child who had never once doubted his own belonging. A gift, she realized with quiet gratitude, that she and Dante had managed to give him, despite everything this family's history might have taught him instead. "Happy?" Dante asked quietly, his hand finding hers beneath the table, in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing in the months since their wedding. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Elena admitted, watching sunlight glint off her wedding ring, off the simple, elegant life they had managed to construct from the wreckage of betrayal and separation. Though I still find myself waiting, sometimes, for the other shoe to drop. Old habits. I understand that feeling better than most, Dante said, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her palm. But I promise you, Elena, whatever challenges this family faces going forward, we face them honestly, together, without the lies and manipulation that nearly destroyed us both. His dark eyes, softer now than she'd ever imagined them capable of being when she'd first returned to this house, held hers with quiet, unwavering certainty. This family's tradition of Sunday dinner nearly tore us apart once, generations of secrets and cruelty disguised as loyalty. I intend to make sure it means something different going forward, something worth actually returning home for. Camille had joined them for dinner as well, a tentative but genuine reconciliation having developed between her and Elena over the preceding months, born from shared understanding of maternal fear and the complicated grief of loving someone capable of terrible things. Her children, Sophia and Marco, sat near Nico now, the three of them forming an easy, uncomplicated friendship that spoke to a new generation's capacity to move beyond the sins of the one before it. As the meal began, plates passed hand to hand around the long table, conversation rising and falling in comfortable waves rather than the tense, calculated silences Elena remembered from her first terrified visit to this house. She found herself thinking of Vincenzo, of his final months spent desperately trying to set right what greed and betrayal had broken, of the strange, unlikely gift he had given them all, by insisting on one final, truth-revealing dinner before his death. "To Papa," Dante said suddenly, rising with his wine glass raised, drawing the table's attention with the natural authority of a man who had fully grown into his role as head of this complicated, healing family, who understood in the end that no empire is worth building on lies, who gave us the truth, however painful, and in doing so, gave us back each other. His eyes found Elena's, then dropped to Nico, who was watching his father with rapt, solemn attention, despite not fully understanding the weight of the moment. And to family. Not the family defined by blood alone, or by old grudges and manufactured betrayals, but the family we choose to build, honestly, together, one Sunday dinner at a time. "To family," the table echoed, glasses raised in a toast that felt, to Elena, like the true beginning of something the Falcone family had never quite managed to achieve in all its decades of power and violence. Not just survival, but genuine, hard-won peace. Later that evening, after the extended family had departed and Nico had finally succumbed to exhausted sleep following a day full of cousins and dinosaur stories, Elena stood with Dante on the mansion's balcony, watching the sun set golden and warm over the grounds where so much had changed in the span of a single year. 5 years apart, Dante murmured, his arms wrapped around her from behind, chin resting against her hair as they watched the sky shift through brilliant shades of orange and violet. I used to think we'd lost those years forever, that nothing could give them back to us. We didn't get those years back, Eleanor agreed softly, leaning into his warmth. But we got something else instead. A future neither of us could have imagined. Back when we were young and reckless enough to believe love alone could conquer everything. And now? Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had once been a stranger's cold, dangerous mask and had become, through everything they'd survived together, the truest home she had ever known. "Now I believe something different," she said quietly. "That love doesn't conquer everything on its own. But love, combined with truth, with courage, with the willingness to burn down every lie standing between you and the people you're meant to be with, that's enough. That's more than enough." Dante's answering smile was soft, unguarded, entirely unlike the careful mask he'd worn on the day she returned to this house, believing herself walking back into nothing but old wounds and buried grief. "Then let's make sure every Sunday dinner from now on is worth returning home for," he said, leaning down to seal the promise with a kiss as the last light of day faded gently into the soft, hopeful dark of a new beginning. Inside the mansion, Nico slept peacefully in a home that finally, truly belonged to him, the last Falcone heir, born of love that had survived betrayal, separation, and the darkest schemes an ambitious man could construct, now growing up surrounded by a family finally fully committed to honesty over legacy, love over power, and truth over the comfortable, dangerous lies that had once nearly cost them everything. The Falcone family's Sunday dinners would continue generation after generation, but never again would they be built on secrets buried deep enough to destroy the people who deserved, more than anything else, simply to come home.